Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, often completely contradictory puzzle at the heart of U.S. foreign policy, the intersection of arms sales and human rights. We're going to look really closely at a tension that has defined international security for decades, literally regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office.
So think about this for a second. Can the world's leading champion of peace also be its absolute biggest arms dealer? Let's dive right into this paradox. We're going to examine the glaring gap between the official ethical standards of the United States and the harsh, on-the-ground realities of its global security policy. It's a question that challenges the entire narrative of global leadership. How on earth do you balance human rights with the highly lucrative, deeply strategic business of selling weapons?
Act 1, the strategy of alliances and division. To really understand how we got here, we've got to go back to an ancient strategy. Divide et impera, or divide and rule. You see, Western powers, including the US, have historically leaned on these exact tactics in the Middle East and beyond. By arming pragmatic allies, whether we're talking about the Mujahideen during the Cold War or other proxy forces, superpowers can very efficiently weaken their rivals in the short term. But as our sources show, this almost always creates massive long-term destabilization. It just breeds new conflicts and deep-seated animosity. Now, let's put this into perspective by comparing two totally different presidential approaches. On one hand, we have Bill Clinton in the 1990s, whose policies were heavily coded in diplomatic rhetoric. And on the other, we have Donald Trump's overtly transactional America First strategy. Let's look at the reality hiding just under the surface of the Clinton administration. Despite all that diplomatic rhetoric, Clinton actually pushed a very pragmatic divide and rule partition in Bosnia, right as the horrors of the Srebrenica massacre were unfolding. He effectively pressured leaders into making territorial compromises. On top of that, his administration provided a whopping $6 billion in military aid to Turkey. They completely bypassed U.S. laws that were specifically meant to stop arms from going to human rights abusers, even as the Turkish military used those exact weapons in a scorched earth campaign that resulted in 35,000 Kurdish civilian deaths. Conversely, Trump flipped the script to a purely economic metric to evaluate alliances. As the data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies lays out, Trump created a literal safe zone and danger zone for allies. Look at this. If a country had a trade deficit with the US and spent more than 3% of their GDP on defense, they were totally safe. But if they ran a trade surplus and underspent on their military, they were in the crosshairs. Human rights records, they simply didn't factor into the equation at all. And this quote brilliantly illustrates that transactional shift. By openly declaring he would encourage adversaries to do whatever the hell they want to allies who didn't hit financial targets, the policy shifted entirely. It prioritized financial contributions and arms purchases over traditional diplomatic ties, mutual defense, or any sense of global stability. Act 2. Bypassing the rules. Okay, you might be wondering, if there are rules against this, how do administrations just maneuver around them? Well, it all comes down to the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy, or CAT. Established back in 1979, this was originally supposed to be a policy of self-imposed restraint. But the reality? The CAT policy frequently gets rewritten, reinterpreted, or frankly just ignored to fit the economic and strategic goals of whoever happens to be sitting in the Oval Office. A really prime example of this maneuvering is a somewhat bureaucratic but massively impactful shift made during the Trump administration. They actually transferred the oversight of firearms exports away from the State Department, which focuses on human rights and requires public reporting, over to the Commerce Department. And the Commerce Department focuses on trade and doesn't even have to report export transactions. This drastically reduced transparency. Now, what's super interesting here is that Joe Biden explicitly promised to reverse this exact policy during his campaign, but our sources indicate that he hasn't done it yet. But perhaps the most mind-blowing bypass of the rules was when the Trump administration utilized an obscure emergency provision to push through a massive $8.1 billion weapons sale to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. By just suddenly declaring a national emergency, they completely dodged the mandatory 30-day congressional review period. And they pushed this emergency certification through despite massive, totally bipartisan concern from lawmakers. Literally, both Republicans and Democrats were actively trying to block these transfers because of the horrific civilian casualties being caused by Saudi and UAE airstrikes in Yemen. But the executive branch just sidestepped them entirely. Now, as this breakdown shows, we're not just talking about defensive gear here. These sales included over $1 billion in bombs and missiles, plus billions more in aircraft and support. This weaponry made its way directly to the front lines of what the UN has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis, heavily implicating U.S. hardware in the devastation.
Act 3. The human cost. Let's bring this down to reality for a minute and look at the actual human cost. When the Biden administration came in, they officially updated the CAP policy to heavily focus on human rights again. And commendably, they lowered the threshold to halt arms sales, stating that transfers would stop if it was merely more likely than not that the weapons would be used to commit atrocities. But in practice, there is a glaring say versus do gap. The administration just hasn't acted in accordance with its own lower standard. Tragically, we're seeing U.S. weapons sold under the current administration being used in some truly severe atrocities. Human Rights Watch documented Saudi border guards using U.S.-provided mortars to kill hundreds of fleeing Ethiopian asylum seekers. Over in Gaza, U.S.-provided munitions were used by Israel in strikes that hit UN refugee camps, schools, and hospitals, actions that have been investigated by the UN as potential war crimes. Compounding all of this, the U.S. end-use monitoring regime currently fails to even track how its defense equipment is actually used in incidents of civilian harm.
When you zoom out, a really stark pattern emerges. Whether it's the State Department failing to halt arms to Turkey during the 1974 invasion of Cyprus, Clinton arming Turkey in the 90s, Trump arming the Saudi coalition in Yemen, or Biden continuing transfers to Israel today, this timeline proves that regardless of the era, the political party, or the officially stated policy, economic and strategic incentives just continuously override human rights standards. And we absolutely can't ignore the sheer financial gravity driving all this. To put it into perspective, revenue per sale of military equipment jumped to $15.7 billion shortly after the Trump administration eased restrictions on munitions like laser-guided bombs, which reversed an Obama-era ban. The economic incentive of the arms trade is simply staggering, which perfectly tees up this powerful quote capturing the core conflict of modern U.S. foreign policy. You can write all the internal memos and policies you want, but the physical reality of flooding conflict zones with high-tech weaponry fundamentally undercuts the role of a peacekeeper.
Conclusion: profit over principles.
So, circling back, who actually plays this divide-and-rule game better? Well, the truth revealed by the data is that it's a system of bipartisan destabilization. Both major political approaches leverage arms and division. They just use completely different public relations strategies. Clinton masked it with diplomacy, Trump made it explicitly financial, and Biden points to human rights thresholds that ultimately aren't enforced. But at the end of the day, they all contribute to the long-term destabilization of conflict zones worldwide. Which leaves us with this absolutely crucial question to chew on. As long as arms sales remain a foundational pillar of both economic growth and strategic foreign policy, can we ever truly expect global stability? Or are we just arming the next generation of conflicts? Think about that for a while. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.